I'm Matt Swartley with Chariot Solutions, and I would like to introduce you to Carson Gross, who runs Big Sky Software, which has produced HTMX, Hyperscript, intercooler.js, and many other open source tools. He also teaches computer science at Montana State University. Carson is going to speak with us today about Hypermedia, and specifically about how Hypermedia-driven applications can help cure JavaScript fatigue. So please welcome Carson Gross.
Thanks a bunch, Matt. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And let me make sure I get the right one shared. And I got to make sure my audio is sharing. All right, I think we're good to go. All right. Well, thank you again for that introduction, Matt. I am today going to talk to everyone about Hypermedia. And Hypermedia is one of those concepts that is so familiar to us that we probably haven't thought very deeply about it in a long time. And so I'm hoping in this talk I can show people who haven't thought about Hypermedia maybe for a long time that there's new and interesting stuff happening in it, and sort of not in the HTML, in the proper HTML spec, but outside of that space. The subtitle is Curing JavaScript Fatigue Using the Original Architecture of the Web. And the idea is that you maybe, or someone you love, may be experiencing JavaScript fatigue, they may be looking around for a solution to it. And I think that by going back and re-examining exactly the way the original web worked, looking at that as an architectural decision, and maybe thinking about how we could adopt that architectural decision for modern applications, maybe we can have a chance at curing JavaScript fatigue. And I have to admit, I'm a little bit of a goose in Untitled Goose Game here. I like just sort of poking the bear, I have a very contrarian nature, so fair warning in advance. So JavaScript fatigue, you may have heard this term before, but what is it exactly? Well, if you've gone to JavaScript and front-end conferences for the past decade and a half, what you've probably noticed is that there's been an explosion of technologies in the JavaScript world. And it can be very difficult to keep up with not only the latest library that's out there, but even the latest versions of existing libraries. There's a huge amount of churn that has just become sort of endemic to the JavaScript world. And part of that is, we're exploring a new medium, we're exploring a new infrastructure. There's a lot of ideas that are being tried out. But I think there's also some cultural aspects that it's taken root, where people are looking for the new thing in JavaScript, and I don't blame them for that. That's the culture. But I think we're also getting to a point where we have to maybe take a step back and ask ourselves, we've got some pretty complicated tools at this point. And is the cost of that complexity worth it? Are the benefits that we are accruing from that complexity worth the cost of this complexity? And JavaScript fatigue is, I think, a general expression of this sense of being overwhelmed by the amount of JavaScript technology that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So this video does a much better job of capturing the humor of the situation than I ever do. I recommend highly going and looking it up. It's an interview with a senior JS developer in 2022. I'm just going to play a small clip.
Really? Yeah, we used React. We actually used Preact. We actually used Svelte. We actually went back to vanilla JavaScript. Yeah, we're using a library for this. Well, that we rewrote to vanilla JavaScript because it wasn't efficient. We're stuck with this messy language now. I love it. JavaScript. Yeah.
So that's JavaScript, and I think you're probably
we use React
with that. You're probably familiar with that general sense. That whole video is definitely worth watching. It's very well done, pretty hysterical video to watch. Maybe in a sad haha sort of way if you're a front end developer, but it captures this sense of being overwhelmed by the amount of change and churn and that we have to deal with. So. I'm going to suggest, because I'm a contrarian by nature again, that maybe it's time to pause and reflect and to think about, okay, how did we get here? were there any other options? How did we end up in this spot? And were there any other options that we could have taken? What would the web look like if we had taken one of these other options? And I think to answer these questions, we need to revisit, we need to sort of go through how the web developed, because to understand how we got here, you have to understand where we started and the problems with that original model, where we started with the web. So the web started back in the mid to early 1990s, and it was based on this notion of hypermedia. Hypermedia was the big, cool idea with it. And the hypermedia that you're probably everyone's familiar with at this point is a hypertext called HTML. That's what we use on a day-to-day basis for doing web development. And what's, I think, certainly I didn't appreciate it at the time, but hypermedia and HTML in particular it's a radically new way of distributing software. It should be compared with older thick client models. So the way it worked, in the 1980s, you downloaded a thick client application, you downloaded an application, and then it spoke some often proprietary language to a backend and retrieved data and then displayed it to you, and you click buttons or whatever and updated stuff. And it was this big, thick piece of technology. Well, Hypermedia did away with all that and instead introduced this notion of a browser. And the browser was a pretty magical piece of software. And let's talk about why. The reason why a browser is such an interesting piece of technology was actually recognized. I mean, the people who were building this knew, hey, this is very different, very interesting. And Roy Fielding, who was one of the original engineers on the Apache project, recognized this, and he wrote a famous paper, his dissertation on this topic. And what he recognized was that the web wasn't just like kind of a neat new thing, for showing images or like small bits of information, but it was a new network architecture. He recognized this is a new network architecture, and he wrote again his thesis on this, and that's where we get the terms REST and HADIAS from. So REST and HADIAS come from this paper that he wrote, and this new network architecture can be described as follows. It was stateless, and it was layered, and then it consisted of something called a uniform interface. The uniform interface was particularly revolutionary. I don't feel like this has been very well explained, and I don't have a ton of time to spend on it in this talk, but it really was the uniform interface that I think made the web so unique. And what the uniform interface means is that a general purpose web browser could interact with any sort of backend. So a contact application, clothing store, email, pet food, like anything. That was pretty revolutionary to have this single client that could interact with pretty much any sort of application. And the reason it was uniform is that the uniform interface was hypermedia. So the browser didn't need to understand what a contact was. Instead, it could just know what HTML was and display it. And then sure, a contact application could be created in this. So it just had to know how to render hypermedia. And so the client became decoupled from the backing model, the server side model, in a very interesting and new and unique way. So this ended up being super flexible, and you can tell it's super flexible because of all the different web applications that have been built against a single client, basically the web browser. What I want to do is I want to take a quick walk through a specific example just to show you the difference between the hypermedia approach and then the data-oriented approach. So, which today you would probably use a JSON API. So let's look at we have two requests over here that I want to examine. And these are both HTTP requests, they're responses, excuse me. One in HTML and one in JSON. So this is a hypermedia, and this is JSON, which I would call a data or an RPC style API. So they're both representations, as you can see, if you take a second to look at them, they're both representations of a bank account that's in good standing. The thing to notice, or where you start to see the power of hypermedia, is that the hypermedia representation of this resource encodes not only the data about it, but also all of the actions that are available on this piece of data. The JSON version, on the other hand, is a little more efficient. It's a little bit tighter, but it really doesn't have this additional information in it. It doesn't have what we would call a uniform interface, in that this status needs to be interpreted by the client and turned into these actions. So the actions aren't encoded in the response that are available on this account. Rather, there's a status, and then you have to know as a client what a status means. And you write that code, say, okay, if it's active, then they can click on these buttons or whatever. And again, that's in contrast with this Hypermedia, which is able to just say, here's the things that are available in a dropdown, or this is obviously very simple HTML. What this means is that a client that is interpreting this data API is required to understand the concept of a bank account, and is required to understand what a status means. The Hypermedia representation doesn't require that of a client. All the Hypermedia representation requires of the client is that it understands how to render Hypermedia to a human. So let's consider a situation where this account goes into an overdrawn status. What do the responses look like? Well, the HTML response you can see is much smaller. There's only the ability to make a deposit. The JSON response looks pretty similar to its preceding version. It's just changed the status to an overdrawn, to the value overdrawn. And so the client needs to understand what that means and only render the appropriate actions based on that. Well, a browser doesn't need to know that at all. Browser doesn't need to know that. It doesn't know what overdrawn is, doesn't even know what a bank account is, doesn't know anything about that. Instead, it just knows I have to render this, and everything is defined in terms of Hypermedia, and that's it. And I can do that for a bank. I can do that for a contact application. I can do that for an email client, whatever. The browser will continue to just render HTML. And so this gives you a huge amount of flexibility. So if you change this API, then all of your clients need to be updated to understand, okay, I've added a new status. Not so with the Hypermedia model. In the Hypermedia model, the browser just sees the new, if you add an action, if you remove an action, if you add a new status, whatever it is, just sees the new HTML and renders it to the end user. And that's it. That makes it very, very flexible. So that is, I think, a good contrast between a Hypermedia API and a data API. That's why Hypermedia is so flexible, and that's why so many applications were built so quickly in Hypermedia. It also is why Hypermedia applications tend not to be as concerned with API churn as data APIs are. Data APIs are more concerned with churn because there's sort of side channel knowledge that's necessary in order to interpret this properly. Here, everything is encapsulated within the Hypermedia response. All right. So that's great. That was Web 1.0, and things were amazing. The flexibility of this new medium allowed people to build a huge number of services and reach millions and then billions of people. There was one problem though, and that problem was that the UIs were pretty terrible. So this was Amazon 1.0. Amazon doesn't have the best API or best UI in the world in general, but still, this was pretty bad. People, and not only just the look of it, but also the feel of these applications, they felt clunky. So you'd click on a link and you'd wait, and this little dinosaur would like run around a star or something like that. There was all sorts of crazy stuff going on early on, but it just didn't feel great. And so a technology was added to the browser almost accidentally called JavaScript. And Brendan Eich was the person who created this and kind of famously jammed it in very quickly. JavaScript was then combined with a new technology called Ajax, which was brought to us by Microsoft. People tend to forget that, which allowed you to make these web requests sort of behind the scenes, so out of band, not in the normal click a link or submit a form mechanism that the web was originally built on. So it was outside the normal Hypermedia flow. And people loved it. People loved it because now you could build much richer user interfaces on the web. So you had better UX, you had a cool new programming language you could mess around with, and eventually these applications became so large and just with so much code that frameworks emerged in order to manage them. So and these eventually became known as single page frameworks, and that's because of the fact that since these requests were being issued in the background, they tended to not change the nav bar. And so it felt like there was a single page that was able to do everything for you, in contrast with a multi-page application, which is the more traditional model where you click on a link and go to a new page. So the SPA movement did away almost entirely with this notion of pages, and frankly, did away with the notion of hypermedia and moved to this very JavaScript-centric, JSON interaction-driven mechanism. So you typically had a JavaScript model, and you do today. This is sort of the standard model for many people. You have a JavaScript model living in memory, and then HTML just becomes something that you produce from that, often in a reactive manner, you produce from that backing model. So this is now the dominant paradigm in web development. And I like to point out in talks like this, that this is in some ways a return to an older model of software development. This is an older client server model. So you don't have hypermedia typically being exchanged with a server anymore. We've abandoned that in many cases. And instead we're exchanging JSON, and that's a fixed format data API. And the technologies around JSON are increasingly moving towards a more RPC, remote procedure call, like shape and feel. That's the direction they're heading. And I understand why that is. But I want to consider a potential different direction we could have gone with the web. So what if, rather than addressing the web 1.0 clunkiness with JavaScript, what if we had instead improved HTML? What if HTML had become more expressive? Would that have helped? What if we had made it such that in HTML, any element could issue a request rather than just links and forms, right? Right now we have links that can issue a get, and we have forms that can issue a get or a post. Why should only clicks and submits be the events that actually trigger a server interaction? That seems limiting and unnecessary. So what if we did away with that? What if we generalized that idea of allowing any event to trigger a server interaction? What if we surfaced there's all these other actions, these other HTTP actions that are currently only available in JavaScript, right? Like put, patch, delete, these very useful for implementing RESTful systems actions in HTTP that just they're just unfortunately not available in a standard HTML. And then I think the most important one to think about is, what if these hypermedia interactions didn't have to replace the whole page? What if they didn't have to just have this big giant chunk every time where they pull down a full new web page and then replace the whole screen, get that flash of unstyled content, all the bad stuff that's associated. Now, browsers have gotten better at it, admittedly, but still, it just doesn't feel right to me that's a constraint imposed on the hypermedia model. And at some level, I like to say, what if HTML had kept going? What if instead of going off and doing WebGL and all this stuff, what if they had said, hey, let's keep pushing HTML forward as a hypermedia? And if they had done that, could we implement modern UX patterns in pure HTML without needing JavaScript? So things like active search, inline editing, infinite scroll, and lazy loading. Well, maybe we could have. But we didn't, unfortunately, or they didn't, I should say. So we're stuck with HTML5 and what it gives us, or are we? Well, it turns out we do have a technology that allows us to extend the functionality of browsers, and that technology is JavaScript. So what if we used JavaScript to fix HTML? I think that would be pretty funny. I think that would be pretty funny. And it turns out it is actually pretty funny. So I've done that in a library with the help of some friends, some internet friends anyways. I've done that in a library called HTMX. And HTMX is a small, it's about 12K, I think, library that allows you to implement many of these modern UX patterns that we're used to reaching for JavaScript immediately for using Hypermedia, just using plain old HTML. And HTMX itself is written in JavaScript, but an HTMX user, someone who's actually using HTMX to achieve something, typically doesn't write very much JavaScript, or often they don't write any JavaScript at all. So we're actually using JavaScript to avoid using JavaScript, which is pretty funny. So to give you a concrete example of what HTMX looks like, here's some HTMX code, and I put code in quotation marks because I've been told that HTML is not a real programming language. And that may be true, but nonetheless, I think when we get done with this example, you'll see that it can be quite expressive, even if it's not a full programming language. So the way HTMX works is you add attributes, sort of declarative attributes, inline in your HTML. And those attributes are interpreted by the HTMX library, and functionality is added to the page based on them. And so here we've got, I think, a total of 4 attributes. So let's just go through them really quickly. So this says HX post. So what that means is this input is going to issue a post to the search URL. Fine, that's fine. Why would it do that? Well, it's going to do that when it's triggered, and it's triggered. The trigger specification is here under HX trigger. You can see key up, changed, delay 500 milliseconds. And what that is saying is on key up. So when a key is released, and when the value of this input has changed, wait 500 milliseconds, and if no more key ups occur, then issue that request. So this is called debouncing. This debounces that so that we don't issue a request on every key up. That would obviously hammer our server. So this is what the trigger is saying: on key up, when the value is changed, if a key up hasn't occurred in 500 milliseconds, issue a post. And then finally, or not finally, but almost penultimately, I guess I should say, we're going to issue a request, and we're going to get back Hypermedia. So we're expecting back Hypermedia. What are we going to do with that Hypermedia? Well, we're going to stick it somewhere in the DOM. Where do we want to stick it? Well, there's another attribute called HX target that lets you specify using a CSS selector. I want you to take that result that comes back from that URL, and I want you to put it into this element in the DOM. And so that element is the search result, the thing with the ID search results. And then finally, because when AJAX requests are occurring, it's often good to show the user, hey, something's going on. We call out an indicator, a spinner, effectively, to show the user, hey, something's going on. You don't need to keep typing or whatever. It's just good UI practice to let them know what's going on. So there's no JavaScript here. There's no JavaScript, at least not any JavaScript that's been written by the HTMX user. But nonetheless, we're going to get some pretty darn dynamic behavior out of it, and we can implement a pretty cool user interface. And I want to point out that the response that comes back from the server is just more HTML, and that HTML is going to be placed in this element. So we're firmly within the original model of the web. We're exchanging hypermedia in a coarse-grained manner, is the way Roy Fielding would say it, with the server. We just now have a much more expressive hypermedium. HTML is just much more expressive, so we can do more cool stuff with it. So I want to kick over and show a live demo of this. You can go to htmx.org to check out HTMX in general. And there's an example section. And under the example section, there's an active search. And there's all the code for it. And all of my examples, I try to have a live example. Let me kill this. Actually, I'm going to reload this page just so it starts empty. So there's an example down here that's just this code, and that's exactly the code that we just went through. And so what you can see is we've got an input here, and you can open up this little thing underneath and it'll show you the mocked requests that are happening. But if I type A, and I wait a second, sure enough, it's going to issue a post and it's going to get back some raw HTML. Now this doesn't have, it's not, it's an HTML partial. It's only bits of it, Hypermedia that are flying back and forth. But you can see we got back a bunch of table rows, and sure enough, those got placed into this table. And if I continue to filter, it's going to keep filtering down. You can see the search that was put up and some content that was returned from the server, some HTML, some hypermedia that was returned from the server. So if I type AES, kind of filters down to the last 2 people that have AES in there, whatever, in their emails or something like that. All right. But you can see, again, we've got this situation where we have a pretty dynamic user interface that is built entirely using hypermedia concepts. So active search is something that I use. Many sites that they could use something like an active search. Whenever I run into a table, I'm like, man, if it doesn't have active search, I sure wish it did. This is a very interactive feeling user experience, but it's done entirely in terms of hypermedia. So that's a good example. And I encourage you, a lot of people don't believe what you can accomplish with HTMX, but there's a huge number of examples. Things like, for example, click to edit, which allows you to do inline editing, and all that is done inline. And that's achieved purely with hypermedia. There's no user land, there's no user JavaScript that's been used for that. It's all driven using HTML going back and forth. All right. So by using JavaScript to improve HTML as a hypermedia, we're actually able to avoid using JavaScript. JavaScript, it turns out, can be part of the cure for JavaScript fatigue. This is dramatically simpler code than writing a huge, React, a huge bit of React infrastructure, for example, to deal with active search. All right, so that's pretty cool. And again, there's a bunch of examples I encourage you to go through on the examples page on htmx.org. Does this mean that we should just go ahead and delete the 250,000 npm packages that are on all of our systems? Should we toss the JavaScript, the good parts book that we bought from O'Reilly into the trash? The answer is no. The answer is no. We should not do so, because JavaScript is a fundamental core technology for the web. It's going to be part of web development for the rest of all of our lives. Furthermore, even in a pure hypermedia application, like we're looking at here, scripting is still an important part of the web. Scripting is still an important part of the web. So REST, the RESTful architecture, is a network architecture. It says nothing in particular. It's the only constraint that it really imposes on the client is that the client interact with the server via hypermedia. But scripting was included as an optional constraint in Roy Fielding's PhD on the architecture of the web. And so I think it's important to understand that context when you think about things like JavaScript and how that JavaScript might fit into a hypermedia oriented application. So in a hypermedia oriented application, or excuse me, a hypermedia driven application, that's the term I'm trying to use, scripting becomes a way to enhance the hypermedia. So it doesn't become a way to interact with it doesn't become a replacement for the hypermedia. It becomes a way to augment the existing infrastructure. It doesn't replace it. And in particular, it doesn't replace that network interaction, that coarse-grained hypermedia application, large chunks of hypermedia flying back and forth. And I want to show you an example that I think captures this concept really, really nicely. And that is an example use of Sortable.js. And Sortable.js is a library that you can use to make it possible to do drag and drop with HTML elements on a page. And it's a great little library. So I have some JavaScript code that I've written up here, and it's using the HTMX onload function so that it's going to get run every time new content is loaded by HTML. And what it does is it just looks for everything with a class called Sortable on it, and then initializes the Sortable library on that thing. And so that sets it up so that drag and drop works on it. you can read up on how exactly to use Sortable.js, but pretty simple little JavaScript library and very nice. Below we have some hypermedia, and that hypermedia you will note has the sortable class on it. So this form inside of it has some, the divs that are inside of this form will be made drag and droppable effectively by this little bit of JavaScript up here. But what you'll note is that this code doesn't interact with the server. Instead, this form listens for an end event. So recall HX trigger is an attribute in HTMX that lets you listen for a particular event that's fired. Well, it turns out that Sortable very nicely triggers a lot of events. And one of the events that it triggers is the end event. I might pick a slightly more specific name to Sortable for that, but it's fine. That's the name of the event. And so what we do is we say, okay, when a drag and drop occurs on the end event, we want to post this form to the /items URL. We're going to post it to the /items URL, and we're going to exchange that as hypermedia. So this is going to be a hypermedia exchange, but nonetheless, we are able to use Sortable.js in our app. We're able to improve the hypermedia that we're able to improve the hypermedia. We're able to improve HTML's usability. But when it comes time to communicate with the server, we're going to stay within this original model of the web. So we're still firmly in the hypermedia model. And you can go to htmx.org/example/sortable and see an example of this in practice. So here's that code that we were just looking at. And sure enough, you can drag and drop things. And you can see there's a little updating deal that happens up there as we reorder, and it's posted to the server. Now you don't have to do it this way. You could have, for example, a click to reorder and then reorder everything and then click to save. All of that could be done. But the important part here from a hypermedia perspective is that the interactions with the server are done via coarse-grained hypermedia interactions. It's hypermedia that's going back and forth. So when we post, we get back a new set of HTML, which is swapped into the DOM, and it's updated. You can see there's a little indicator that shows us it's updating as well. All right. So scripting is still fine. Scripting is good. I've written a whole language for scripting, actually called Hyperscript. So if you're crazy and if this stuff really grabs you and you want to see some other crazy stuff that I work on, you can go to hyperscript.org. And this is a front-end scripting language that's in design. I really sometimes feel like my job was to destroy JavaScript. I don't know. I like this. You can check it out. So scripting is part of the web infrastructure, and I don't want to discourage people from using it when appropriate. But in a hypermedia driven application in any event, scripting should be used in a particular manner. It should be used in a way that augments the hypermedia rather than replaces it. So the final thing I want to say is, what if we took a wrong turn as an industry here? You know, it's happened before. I've been around a while, as the gray in my beard suggests, and I've seen some pretty wrong turns. I've seen some bad ideas come out of some very large and very popular tech companies. So what if we re-examine this? What if we go back and we look at the original architecture of the web? And what if adopting that original architecture could lead to simpler, more flexible, and more coherent web applications in many cases? People have a sense that something has gone amiss in web development right now. There's a general sense that, hey, you know, this just seems really, really crazy. And I think that's right. And I think that for many applications, not for all, because nothing is right for all. You know, there's nothing that's right for everything. But for many web applications, they could actually be built in a much more simple and straightforward manner using a technology like HTMX or Hypermedia in general than using the more popular modern JavaScript frameworks. So here's a famous quote, or not famous, here's a quote by Tom McWright, who's a online sort of thought leader in the web development world. What if everyone's wrong? We've been wrong before, and I agree with that. We have been wrong before. You know, I've been around long enough to see the industry be wrong about stuff for a long time. And I think that abandoning hypermedia entirely was definitely wrong. Doesn't mean, again, that HTMX is right for everything and that hypermedia is right for everything, but it's right for a lot of stuff, and it's right for a lot more stuff than you probably think, right now, without having taken a hard look at tools like HTMX. And there are other tools that are out there that are in this same space. Like you got Hotwire, Unpoly is a great library that does that. And there's actually a really great mobile hypermedia, believe it or not, called Hyperview, like hyperview.org. This is a hypermedia that is designed for mobile, so it actually speaks a more mobile-centric language, hypermedia language, and you're able to do a lot more with it than you can with just sort of HTML. So there's some interesting innovation happening in the hypermedia space. Most of it not at the big companies, and not in the big tech groups or anything like that. But there are people working around the edges. They're working on making hypermedia a more viable, modern web application piece of infrastructure. So I hope that I have caused some problems on purpose, and I'm happy to chat about this. If you're interested in this stuff, again, htmx.org is the place to go. And if you want to jump on the Discord, you can go to htmx.org/discord, and that'll bounce you out to the Discord chat that we use to talk about all this stuff. So, all right, and I think that's it for me. I think that's my talk.
All right. Thank you very much, Carson. I'll put some of those links into the Room B Slack channel.
Okay.
Appreciate the presentation. Let me take a look and see what kind of questions that we have
Sure.
from Slack, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just early on, someone said, thinking aloud, why not just encode the actions in the JSON?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, so people have tried that, and you'll see there's Martin Fowler did a whole thing on the something hierarchy. What is it called? The Richardson maturity hierarchy for RESTful APIs. And there's been this conflation of REST and JSON, in my opinion. So JSON isn't a natural hypermedia, and so people have tried to impose hypermedia concepts on top of it. But I would note that it hasn't been super popular. It just has not been adopted broadly by industry. People, for whatever reason, and I think it's because JSON isn't a native hypermedia, have just not made a lot of headway with that approach to building JSON APIs. There's a deeper reason for I think problems for that. There's a deeper reason for that. And actually, to just give you a link, let me go to intercooler.org. Intercooler.js. Sorry, 1 second. There's actually a talk on this, intercooler.js.org. The deeper, sorry about my dogs. The deeper reason for this problem, there's a Hades is for Humans essay on intercooler.js. And I think what it boils down to is that when you have a JSON API, that API is being consumed by code. And what makes hypermedia so powerful is that the browser is rendering that UI for a human. And so a human can interact with dynamic data that's returned from the browser, from the server, in a way that a code that's interacting with JSON cannot. And so it just ends up that hypermedia is powerful for humans, and we can see that by the success of the web, whereas it appears not to be as powerful when paired with a client consumer like a JSON API would have. So REST does not equal JSON plus HTTP, I agree.
All right, so our earlier question was, I feel like the conventional way to request that data is a GET and sending it via the URL. Any reason why that active search request wouldn't be a GET request? I think that was in reference to your search.
Yeah, let me go and look at that. That's a good point. I've thought about doing it as a GET. I don't know. I just did it as a post, but I agree. The right thing to do, and let me hold on, examples. The right thing to do here in active search is to make this a GET, and then also probably to push the search term up into the browser so it's copy and paste. Well, there's a way to do that. What is it? HTMX push URL. So if you turned it into a GET, you could actually have it so that it, and used HX push URL, it would actually push up into the nav bar, and you'd get that nice copy and pastable search. And I've done that example before. I did this example super early, and so I just haven't updated it. But that's a good point. I agree with that criticism.
All right, someone wrote cool stuff, great POC. How many people, companies are using this? Is there traction?
Is there traction? Well, I'd like to refer you to the front page. I'm very happy to announce a couple months ago, I was happy to announce that JetBrains has sponsored the project. Craft CMS, Big Sky Software, you've never heard of because that's my company, and then ComSpace. But yeah, I think we've got a big vote of confidence from JetBrains. So there are lots of companies that are using it. It's relatively new. It's only been out for about a year, almost 2 years now. There was intercooler.js, which was the previous version, but that was in the jQuery ecosystem. And so this is a clean room, dependency-free library for building hypermedia driven applications. And I think there's a lot of momentum building around it. The Django community just has really latched onto HTMX. So I think that's where you'll see stuff coming out of.
All right, next question here. Is there a point in sufficiently complex applications where HTMX hits its intrinsic limitations?
Yeah.
And a SPA is a better choice? If so, what questions would you ask to determine whether HTMX might not be a fit?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I get it a lot. HTMX makes a lot of sense. The more your web application can be built with coarse grain hypermedia interactions. And so, if you're Google Maps, for example, like that's probably not a good fit for HTMX because there's lots of needly stuff, lots of little things that need to happen. Another example, I think that it wouldn't be good for HTMX would be Google Sheets because you have highly dependent, lots of crazy stuff happening in the UI. And that's just not amenable to exchanging hypermedia with a server. On the other hand, the settings pages for both of those applications might be something that is very amenable to HTMX. And so HTMX itself is very lightweight, it's dependency free, very straightforward to use. And so I would recommend in those situations, maybe considering HTMX for the simpler stuff. And then when necessary for the parts of the app that really demand it, that you're not able to represent with coarse-grained hypermedia interactions, maybe you kick out to Vue or Alpine or React or whatever you're comfortable with for that stuff. I do want to say, however, that I would go through the examples page on htmx.org and see just what's achievable using a pure HTMX, or excuse me, a pure hypermedia approach to building things, because I think you might be surprised how much you can build just in this model, and it's a much simpler model. So save that complexity budget, on your settings page, and use it for the part of the app that makes sense.
All right. So let's see. Next question here. Isn't it a violation of separation of concerns that the data for the table example comes back with row table tags in it, mixing data and presentation?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess at some level it does. I view it as a hypermedia exchange, though. And so I'm not a big separation of concerns guy. And actually, thank you for bringing that up, because on the talk page, if you scroll down on htmx.org, there's a locality of behavior essay. And locality of behavior is a design principle that I prefer in tension with separation of concerns. But in the example cited, we're just exchanging hypermedia. It's what we're getting back is hypermedia. It's not a JSON API. There's no intrinsic intrinsic reason from a separation of concern standpoint why that should matter. That what we're getting back is a hypermedia. We're letting the browser interpret that hypermedia, and that's it. And so I don't think it's so much of a separation of concerns issue where you might, another point that comes up is, well, what if I have a mobile client? A mobile client can't use my Hypermedia API, and I agree with that. And so I think you should have a Hypermedia application, for example, for your web app, and then offer a separate JSON data API, because there are just different needs for those. And there's another essay on the site. Where is it? Hypermedia APIs versus data APIs. So you can read that if you want my thoughts on that topic.
All right, great. Okay, so here's I believe it's a question. Yes, conceptually, this doesn't seem that much removed from something like Angular directive, where you attach an attribute to the DOM element and expose new behavior, and it's all written in TypeScript. But this assumes you don't use Angular routing and other sponnis. I wonder if part of the issue is the opinionated nature of most front-end frameworks.
Yeah, it does have a flavor of Angular directives, but I really want to stress again, think about the hypermedia exchange aspect. Really, the crux here is that we are exchanging hypermedia with the server. So when I go to examples, and for example, like let's do infinite scroll, just because that's kind of a neat one. So we scroll down to the bottom here, and some new stuff shows up, and we look at the requests. What you can see is that we're exchanging hypermedia. We're not exchanging JSON, and that's, again, in stark contrast with most modern SPA frameworks, where JavaScript is given primacy of place. There's a client-side model, and then however that syncs with the backend is like its own problem. It's its own thing. When you're not exchanging hypermedia. So the core distinction between HTMX and most SPA libraries, I think, lies in this idea of embracing hypermedia as the medium of exchange with the server, and then this notion of taking the existing infrastructure, the existing concepts in HTML, and just expanding on them. So we try and take HTML and build incrementally on top of it, instead of saying HTML is this thing we have to produce to get a UI out of the browser, but all of that management and all that, the state and everything, is going to live in JavaScript. So I'd say that's the big distinction between what HTMX is doing and what SPA libraries are doing. So the big conceptual distinction. And I do agree, Rails is RESTful. Anyone who's used HTML has built a better RESTful API than probably some of the most seasoned JSON API builders, because HTML is a hypermedia, and so you almost have to do it that way.
All right, I think that's the end of the questions so far.
Okay.
We got about 10 minutes or so left. Is there anything that you would like to? You've definitely given us a lot of food for thought here. And is there anything you want to leave us with?
Yeah, that was a little packed. You guys want to check out the? Let's take a look at Hyperscript, really quick. So, whoops, not Hyper-Vue, Hyperscript. So as I said, I think scripting is an important part of the web, and but I wanted a scripting language that paired well with HTMX, and so I'm a programming languages person. That's what I studied in grad school. And, I teach the compilers class here and stuff like that. And so I just decided, you know what, let's do it. Let's build another scripting language for the web. And I based it on an old language called Hypertalk, which is, again, I'm showing the gray in my beard here, but there was a system for building user interfaces on the Mac that was available back in the 90s, like late 80s, early 90s, called Hypercard. And Hypercard was this sort of, it was the web before the web, but everything was local. You didn't have network stuff unless you put in additional plugins in. And there was this scripting language that was a part of that development infrastructure that was called HyperTalk, and it had this funny like natural language look to it. And so I decided when I kind of finished up HTMX and I wanted this scripting language, that I would take a crack at porting that concept of HyperTalk of HyperTalk to the web, and I decided to call it Hyperscript because that was available. And so this is what it looks like. So let's go take a look at the docs. That's kind of a crazy example, but so basically what you do, and again, the person who was concerned about the violation of separation of concerns is going to be similarly concerned here. You put your scripting language directly on elements. So here we have a button that toggles the red class on the button when you click it. And so you can see here when we click, it goes back and forth between red and blue. And it's using Hyperscript to do that. So on click, toggle the red class on me. And you can see this is probably pretty jarring for most of the people watching this. But you can see a few things. First of all, we embed the script directly in the HTML, which I wanted because I like it, because again, here's an example of some Hyperscript. And what you'll note about it is that it is, number one, embedded directly in the HTML, which is a little unique, although Alpine.js is making this more popular in the JavaScript community. And number two, it's got this funny natural language flavor to it. So on click, toggle the red class on me. And if I click this, sure enough, it toggles back and forth between red and blue, and it's toggling this red class on the button. So this scripting language, quite elaborate. There's a lot going on here. There's some pretty crazy features in it. But this was a scripting language I created to, this is sort of my take on a scripting language that augments the web or augments the hypermedia model rather than replacing it. And I wanted it to be event oriented, this is taken straight from HyperTalk, the scripting language again for HyperCard, this on whatever, do something. And so I feel like it fits really well with a particular style of scripting that I want to encourage in hypermedia applications. So this is very speculative compared to HTMX. So I think, if this is something you're interested in, jump on the Discord. There's some people that are very interested in it as well, and we're happy to talk about it. There's a lot of interesting stuff that you can do with it. There's this notion of transparent, it's async transparent, so you don't have to worry about resolving promises or anything like that. The runtime takes care of all that for you. It's just a very light touch scripting language that lets you do some light user interface scripting that can really augment the existing hypermedia infrastructure of the web quite easily. So that's, I think, another interesting project that's associated with HTMX if people are interested. And I'm happy to talk about this if anyone wants to. This is my passion project. I like HTMX quite a bit. And I'm very passionate about hypermedia, but Hyperscript is definitely like this is my baby. So.
Cool. Very, very good. All right. I think that's all the questions.
Yeah, I see a couple people. Typing. So I want to. If anyone's got any hypermedia, like, you're insane. Yes, I am insane. Correct. you're correct.
And we can certainly continue the discussion on in the Slack channel too.
I'll hang out in the Slack channel if you want to cut it over.
And you're following along just as well as I am on this, Carson.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Sue the Coder. I appreciate that.
All right. Well, I think we'll call it complete.
Sounds good.
And thank you very much, Carson. I really appreciate your time and the presentation. For everybody that in attendance, Thank
Absolutely.
you for attending and also for all of the questions. I think that was a nice discussion to end the session.
Great.